Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to a time when the smell of raw meat and old onions mingled in the air, and you could find your way to the butcher's stall simply by following the trail of chicken feathers and congealed blood. You're standing in the heart of a medieval town's meat district, where the cobblestones are slick, the dogs are always lurking, and the phrase "don't slip" could mean the difference between an embarrassing fall and a nasty case of dysentery. Welcome to the blood-spattered, bread-wielding world of medieval butchers. You probably won't survive this place if you're squeamish or vegetarian. Here, sanitation is a curious blend of tradition, improvisation, and somehow stale carbs. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it over there? Drop your location and local time in the comments so we can see how far this sleepy butcher shop reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step cautiously into a meat-stained alley that locals have dubbed the sausage spine because it winds down the hill like, well, a spine made of sausages. There's a jarring clang as a cleaver hits a block, then another. Somewhere nearby, a goat is complaining, probably for good reason. It's not exactly peaceful here, but give it time. We'll settle in. The butcher's quarter isn't just about meat. It's where you find old women gossiping over trotters, stray cats nibbling leftover spleens, and delivery boys trying not to faint from the heat and the smell. There's a rhythm to the chaos, a strange comfort in the daily clatter of knives, hooks, and bones hitting stone. Historians still argue whether butchers in medieval Europe had permanent stalls or traveled like meat-wielding nomads. But here in this imagined best-of-everywhere marketplace, your local butcher's got a permanent place, wedged between a fishmonger who never stops shouting and a baker whose bread somehow always tastes slightly of garlic and regret. You duck beneath a hanging row of pig carcasses, which are swaying ever so slightly in the breeze. They cast long, lumpy shadows on the wall. It's oddly soothing, if you ignore the flies. The butcher is already at work. He's got arms like smoked hams and an apron that's seen more action than a battlefield. He nods at you without looking up. There's a calm in his movements, an unspoken routine honed over years of chopping, hauling, and muttering about inconsistent sheep sizes. You watch as he slaps a chunk of mutton onto a block and, thwack, brings down his cleaver with a kind of sleepy precision. Of course, cleanliness isn't high on the list of priorities here. Sure, the guilds have rules, but this isn't exactly a sterile environment. You're more likely to trip over a stray shin bone than find a proper mop. That's where the bread comes in, but we'll get to that. You glance down and see a dog waiting patiently for scraps. He's got one ear chewed clean off, possibly from a bad bet with a badger. The butcher occasionally tosses him bits of gristle with a sort of grudging affection. It's a quiet relationship built on mutual tolerance and offal. A boy scurries past carrying a basket of kidneys. He nearly loses a shoe in the gutter, which at this point is more meat paste than water. That boy, by the way, earns about 3 copper coins a week and is technically an apprentice, though really his job is to run duck and not cry too loudly when the pigs squeal. Somewhere deeper in the alley, someone yells about liver. You can't tell if they're selling it or if they've just misplaced it. And there it is, your first glimpse of the cleaning bread. The butcher reaches behind the counter, grabs what looks like a brick of stale rye, and casually begins wiping his cleaver with it. Crumbs mix with blood, the crust scraping off gristle as he hums a low, tuneless song. You blink. Is that normal? Oh yes. Perfectly normal. You see, the bread isn't food anymore. It's been repurposed, recycled, if you will, into a kind of primitive edible scouring pad. It's coarse enough to scrub, absorbent enough to clean, and disposable enough to throw to the dogs afterward. And sometimes they eat it and live, mostly. There's something strangely meditative about it. The butcher slices, wipes, pausing occasionally to slap a fly off his neck or mumble about the weather. It's not glamorous, but it's real. And honestly, it beats scrubbing metal with your bare hands in cold water while pigeons judge you from the rafters. As you lean back against a stack of firewood, you realize that even here, in the least likely place to fall asleep, the rhythm of life is lulling. The cleaver's steady beat, the dog's soft panting, the occasional crackle of burning fat from the tallow pot. It all blends together into a strange kind of lullaby. Sure, you're probably surrounded by bacteria that haven't even been named yet, but for now, let's not worry about that. Just listen to the bread scrape across steel. You squint at the butcher's work table, trying to make sense of the lineup of strange and brutal-looking instruments he calls tools. There's a cleaver the size of a roofing tile, sure, but then there's also a long-handled hook with a little curl at the end, a stubby thing that looks like it might have once been a spoon, and a serrated knife that's clearly been sharpened on a rock and a prayer. He picks up the hook next. It's stained the color of dried plums. He doesn't even flinch as he hauls a haunch of beef onto the block. You feel the table shudder slightly under the weight. There's a soft grunt of effort. And just like that, he's carving through muscle like it's old cake. It's mesmerizing. Most of these tools have names. Skull cracker, fat twiner, back spine whisperer. Not official titles, but butcher slang passed down over tankards of dark ale. One is just called Gertrude. Nobody asks why. Historians still debate the exact number of tools a working butcher would carry in his satchel, especially in smaller towns. Some say 3 or 4 were enough. Others insist you needed at least a dozen to stay competitive, especially when that show-off 2 stalls over insists on polishing his cleavers every morning like he's forging royal swords instead of slicing pig belly. You edge closer and notice something odd. The tools, while rudimentary by today's standards, are surprisingly well cared for. There's a shine to them. Not polished exactly, but respected. A sort of practical upkeep that speaks to the intimate relationship between man and blade. And that's where the bread comes back in. Before any real washing happens, if it happens, the butcher always gives his tools a quick bread scrub. It's a bit like brushing your teeth with toast. The coarse crust removes meat bits and blood, while the spongy inside absorbs the rest. It's not perfect, but it's quick, effective-ish, and doesn't require a clean water source, which, let's be real, no one's got. The apprentice tosses another hunk of crust onto the table. This one's darker, maybe rye, maybe just aged into a different color. It has the consistency of dried clay and smells faintly of sour beer and onions. Perfect for a heavy clean. You wonder if anyone's ever tried to eat one of these bread bricks after it's been used. The answer, sadly, is yes. Desperate times, war zones, famine winters. Bread used to clean cleavers occasionally ended up back in the soup pot. Not a proud culinary tradition, but a real one. There's a faint rustle behind you. You turn to see a group of children peeking around the corner, eyes wide. One of them whispers something that sounds like, "Is that the neck slicer?" The others giggle. Even now, in the thick of medieval grime and danger, kids are drawn to sharp objects and people who know how to use them. The butcher notices them and winks. Then he slaps a sausage down hard on the block. The kids shriek and run, laughing all the way down the alley. You turn your attention back to the arsenal laid out like a grim picnic. There's something fascinating about the variety. Each piece is designed for a specific job. cleaving joints, stripping sinew, slicing skin without tearing the underlying fat. These are not random bits of iron. They're purpose-built, functional, brutally elegant. One of the more curious items is a small, bent fork-like blade. It's used to tug ligaments out of joints, something that sounds deeply unpleasant but is oddly satisfying to watch. The butcher demonstrates without being asked, just slips it under a tendon and pulls. It comes free like spaghetti. You blink. Somewhere in your brain, a tiny voice says, "That shouldn't be relaxing." But it is. There's a debate among medieval scholars over the origin of a certain double-bladed tool with offset handles. Some argue it was inspired by Moorish bone cleavers. Others claim it was an accidental invention by a Flemish blacksmith who sat on a sickle. Either way, your butcher has one, and he clearly loves it. He picks it up with the sort of care most men reserve for violin bows or babies. Then, for a moment, everything goes still. He turns to the apprentice and says, "Bread." The apprentice hands him a new slab of hardened crust. This one's crustier than the others, possibly dunked in ash water the night before to give it extra grit. Without ceremony, the butcher begins running it down the length of the twin blades, the soft crinkle of friction sounding like someone unwrapping parchment. And just like that, another cleaning ritual is complete. You sit on an overturned barrel and let your gaze travel to the rafters. Up there, drying herbs hang alongside ropes of sausage. You spot what looks like lavender. Or maybe it's just very ambitious mold. The air smells heavy with fat and smoke, but it's not unpleasant anymore. You're settling in. The chaos is starting to feel like rhythm. The routine is starting to soothe you. Back at the table, the butcher finishes cleaning his tools. He lines them up in perfect order, then uses the heel of the same crust to scrub the table clean in long, lazy arcs. It's not sterile, not by modern standards, but it's satisfyingly complete. A circle closed. You close your eyes for a second. The cleaver sings again. The dog sighs. And the butcher? He hums his tuneless song and reaches for the next cut. You blink slowly, your gaze landing once more on that strange little loaf of bread, now damp with blood and flecked with fat. It rests on the corner of the butcher's table like a used paintbrush. He'll toss it soon, maybe to the dog, maybe into the gutter, maybe onto the roof of the bakery next door just for sport. But first, another slice of lamb. Thwack. It's time to talk about the bread itself. Not all bread becomes cleaning bread. There's a hierarchy, a timeline. A loaf might start its life fresh and springy, perfect for breakfast with a smear of ale butter. Then, as it stales, it graduates to stew thickener, crust cutter, or child pacifier. Seriously, toddlers were often handed rock-hard bread ends to chew. But once it's too far gone, when even a goat wouldn't gnaw it, it earns its place in the butcher's toolkit. You reach out to touch a discarded crust. It's solid, almost brick-like. If you dropped it on your foot, you might lose a toe. It smells faintly sour like yeast that has long since given up. There's something ingenious about it. In an age without sponges, steel wool, or even rags clean enough to be worth washing, a dense loaf of day-old bread made perfect sense. It's abrasive enough to scour, absorbent enough to soak up blood, and, crucially, disposable. Historians still argue whether this practice began in northern Italy or was simply a case of parallel invention across multiple regions. The earliest known mention of cleaning bread shows up in a 13th century market ordinance from Bruges, which forbade butchers from tossing crusts stained with beast's blood into the town wells. That's probably a good rule, and it wasn't just a one-type-fits-all situation. Butchers had preferences. Rye was firmer, sourdough was chewier, barley loaves left fewer crumbs. Some swore by a 2-day-old hunk of wheat bread rubbed with vinegar beforehand. Just enough acidity to keep flies disinterested for an hour or two. Others liked crusts baked with ash or bran for their added grit. You chuckle to yourself. Somewhere, some long-dead bread maker had a side hustle selling sanitary loaves to half the butcher stalls in town. Niche market, but clearly effective. Today's cleaning loaf is particularly stubborn. The butcher mutters something under his breath as he uses it to polish the metal edge of a bone saw. You swear the bread actually squeaks from the friction. A few drops of grease spatter your boot. You don't mind. It's part of the ambiance now. The apprentice, arms deep in a barrel of tripe, watches the bread scrubbing like it's the highlight of his day. It might be. He's got one crust tucked into his belt already, ready for his own cleaning duties later. It's a rite of passage, really. Your first cleaver, your first mess, your first bread wipe. Meanwhile, the dog has spotted the blood-soaked loaf on the edge of the table. He creeps closer, belly low to the ground, eyes fixed on the prize. The butcher notices but says nothing. There's an unspoken agreement between the two. He waits. The dog inches closer, then plop. The bread lands in the dirt with a wet thud. The dog grabs it and trots away victoriously, tail high, crumbs flying. You wonder how long the bread remains edible in any sense of the word. The answer depends on your definition of edible. During lean winters, even cleaning crusts found their way into peasant stews. Boiled long enough, the blood, marrow grease, and grit melted into a strangely nutritious, deeply unappetizing soup. It filled bellies, and that was enough. Of course, if you were really desperate, there were recipes. Wound bread, they called it in some regions. Scraps of bread used for cleaning wounds or tools, then soaked again in ale or broth and served to the poor. It's not in any modern cookbooks. There's a faint drizzle now. You feel the drops on your face. The butcher glances up at the sky and sighs. The roof is leaking again. He shifts a wooden slat to cover the tools. The cleaning bread, too, is protected. Wet bread is no good. Not for scrubbing, not for eating, not for dogs. You catch the edge of the apprentice's grin. He likes this part. Protecting the sacred loaf. A woman arrives at the stall. She's older, wrapped in a thick cloak, and muttering about neck bones. The butcher nods, slices a few pieces, and reaches once more for the crust. Swipe, swipe. Clean. It's hard to tell where habit ends and necessity begins. The bread isn't ceremonial. It's not glamorous. But it's dependable. Like a favorite tool that just happens to crumble under pressure. Literally. You shift on your barrel and realize something. You're not watching a man clean his tools anymore. You're watching a system, a quiet logic built from scarcity and survival. In a world where rags were scarce, soap was expensive, and water often unsafe, bread was the perfect fallback. And in a way, that makes sense. The same food that sustains life can, in the right shape, help preserve the tools that bring that food to the table. It's all circular. Grimy, yes, but circular. The butcher finally takes a break. He leans on the table, one hand still holding the now shapeless loaf. He takes a breath. You do too. You're not sure how long you've been here, but the rhythm of the day is sinking in. The scrape of bread on metal, the sound of blood trickling into sawdust, the distant jingle of a goat being led to market. It all blends into a gentle lull. You close your eyes again. Someone in the distance starts whistling. The butcher hums along. The morning haze has lifted a bit now, and so has the tang in the air. You breathe in, and there it is. The unmistakable scent of a medieval butcher's life. Blood warmed by sunlight, sawdust thick with drippings, hints of old fat, fresh sinew, and something suspiciously like fermented turnip. But dominating it all, sausage. The smell wraps around you like a thick woolen cloak. A little meaty, a little spicy, and very much alive. Sausages hang in neat rows from hooks above the butcher's workspace, some plump and pink, others shriveled and grayish, waiting for their next stage of transformation. Some will be smoked, others boiled, a few sold off raw to families who think boiling meat for 8 hours is a personality trait. And below these sausages, stacked knives, a bloody table, and the ever-faithful cleaning bread. The butcher's mid-morning routine is in full swing. It's less frantic now, more methodical. The crowds are thinner. A few customers stop by, mutter requests, exchange coins or bartered goods, and leave with wrapped bundles of "something lean, please," or "just fat, I'm making broth." The boy is wiping his hands on his tunic. This, of course, defeats the purpose of having hands in the first place. He frowns, grabs a hunk of the crustiest bread, and begins scrubbing his little knife with the kind of exaggerated care only an apprentice can muster. You can't help but smile. He's proud of this moment. This is his tool, his ritual. Historians still debate how often apprentices were allowed to clean their own blades, let alone wield them. In some cities, guild records suggest a boy wouldn't touch steel until his 3rd year. In smaller villages, everyone was working with something sharp by age 8, not always safely, but definitely earnestly. The butcher lifts his apron and wipes his forehead. He's been up since dawn. It's not glamorous, this work, but it's steady. There's a rhythm to it that most people overlook, and you're beginning to hear it more clearly now. Swipe, chop, shuffle, wipe. Swipe again. There's even a sound to the bread as it does its job, sort of a dry rasp, like dragging fabric over a stone. You're convinced it's almost musical now, like percussion from the least sanitary orchestra imaginable. One customer brings a basket of herbs in exchange for ribs. The butcher inspects the rosemary, nods, and gestures to a slab of pork. The deal is done. A sprinkle of herbs hits the table. The apprentice, without missing a beat, wipes them up with, you guessed it, another loaf end. Bread, the all-purpose medieval napkin. You'd think, in a world of boiling, smoking, salting, and burning things to kill germs, someone would invent a better cleaning method. But soap is expensive. Cloth is reusable, but risky. It spreads rot just as easily as it cleans. Bread? You use it, you toss it, and it feeds something afterward. Circle of life, or at least the circle of digestion. The butcher slices open a cow tongue next. He peels back the layers with practiced fingers, revealing the inner muscle like it's a piece of art. You hear the soft splat as it lands on the block. He nods, satisfied, then wipes his knife with the loaf. Not a single thought crosses his brow. This is just how things are done. There's a story he tells, half joke, half truth, about the time he forgot to use the bread and wiped his blade with the sleeve of his apprentice's tunic instead. The boy didn't notice for an hour. When he did, he cried, then tried to sue him at the guild hall. The guild laughed him out of the room. They called it Breadless Monday for months after that. There's a little brass bell at the front of the stall. It rings as a traveling merchant approaches. She's got bolts of fabric under one arm and a tired-looking ferret on her shoulder. She orders chicken livers, pays in salted dates, and asks if she can take the day-old cleaning loaf for her pig. The butcher shrugs, "Waste not." As she walks away, the ferret sniffs the loaf approvingly. You watch them disappear into the alley, crumbs trailing behind like a breadcrumb path in reverse. In the corner of the stall, there's a clay bowl with a sludgy mix of ashes, old ale, and something thick enough to be soup. Occasionally, the butcher dips a knife in it for a deeper clean. But it's clear the bread is still the favorite. Less mess, less smell, and oddly satisfying to hold, especially if you imagine it squealing a little under pressure. A scholar once described this ritual as culinary penance. Bread, the sacred food of life, used to wipe away the gore of death. Poetic, messy, very medieval. The dog is back. He's circling the cleaning pile like a shark. You wonder if he's keeping track of the different loaves. Perhaps he has preferences. This one was rye. That one was barley. Maybe he likes the ones with marrow best. You lean back, letting the sounds of the market blend together. A goat bleating, someone singing badly. A fishmonger yelling something about eels. In the midst of it all, the butcher's steady movements continue. Thwack, wipe, swipe, toss. You're starting to doze a little now. The air has warmed. The smells are dulling into background hums. There's a peacefulness in the repetition, in the humanness of it all. In a world without plastic, without bleach, without rules we now take for granted, someone figured out that the same loaf that feeds your belly can also clean your blade. Not perfectly, not even well, but just enough to keep going. And that's kind of beautiful. You're leaning against the edge of a barrel now, legs outstretched, when you hear a sudden, wet thunk. It's not a cleaver this time. It's something softer, stranger. The butcher has just lopped off a pig's foot, and it flops to the floor with a slap. He curses, mildly, almost affectionately, and flicks it back onto the table with the tip of his boot. You don't flinch anymore. You're used to this. But if you're not careful, you might end up with fewer fingers than you started with. In medieval butchery, accidents weren't accidents. They were occupational hazards. Inevitable, even expected. You can't spend your life gripping a slippery cleaver over slick oak boards without occasionally removing something that was supposed to stay attached. The butcher lifts his left hand. You count. 4 fingers and a very convincing stub. He catches your glance, shrugs, and grins. "Chicken got me," he says, like it's a joke. Maybe it is. Historians still argue whether guilds kept official records of butchery-related injuries. Some archives mention fines for bloodied blades left beneath foot, while others hint at early forms of compensation. Meat credits, basically, for lost digits. It's hard to prove, but very easy to imagine. The apprentice, not to be outdone, holds up his own hands for comparison. All 5 fingers. For now. He waggles them with pride, only to nearly drop a beef shin on his own foot seconds later. The tools, of course, don't help. They're not exactly ergonomic. You've got blades honed to cut through bone but shaped like they were designed by a hungover blacksmith. Handles are wrapped in old twine or leather if you're lucky. Many are bare metal. One is, alarmingly, just a sharpened bone with another smaller bone lashed to it. Add to this a constant layer of grease on every surface, and you've got yourself the medieval version of a workplace accident waiting to happen. The bread? Oh, it doesn't prevent accidents, but it does help spot them. Blood on a blade is one thing, but when you wipe it with bread and it comes back redder than usual, that might not be pig. You watch the butcher absent-mindedly press his thumb against a cleaned knife edge. He nods, satisfied with the sharpness, then sucks a tiny nick from his skin. A few drops land on the already used crust, darkening it like spilled wine. It's a weirdly intimate moment. He doesn't even flinch. One of the more bizarre entries in a 14th century Swiss Guild manual involved a mandatory bread test. Every morning, a butcher was to demonstrate that his blade could slice cleanly through a half loaf, stale, of course, without tearing the crumb. A dull blade was a danger not just to meat, but to fingers, apprentices, and customers. Bread wasn't just for cleaning, it was for proof. And if you were careless, if you were sloppy, that crust would tell on you. It showed everything. The blade's alignment, its edge, its residue. A butcher could glance at his scrubbing loaf and know whether it was time to sharpen or time to see the apothecary. You shift your attention to the gutter running past the stall. It's alive now. Tiny rivers of pink water, congealed bits of organ meat, the occasional stray chickpea from a nearby stew pot. You see something that looks like an eyeball. You stop looking. And yet, despite all this, there's a strange calm. Even with the threat of dismemberment, even with knives flying and bones crunching, there's a practiced rhythm, like a butcher's ballet if the dancers were burly and their shoes permanently soaked in fat. The dog wanders back into frame. He limps a little, probably from stepping on something sharp years ago. He eyes the crust with a blood spot and sniffs it with suspicion. Smart dog. He passes. The apprentice isn't so lucky. In a moment of distraction, he slices the edge of his palm on a small boning knife. Not deep, but enough to draw a line of red. The butcher rolls his eyes, yanks a clean, well, less dirty, bread hunk from the corner and presses it into the boy's hand. It's ridiculous. But it works. The crust staunches the bleeding better than any cloth would. It's disposable, absorbent. A moment later, the boy is back at work, holding his hand awkwardly like a bird with a broken wing. There's an old wives' tale that goes, if the butcher loses a finger, you'll have extra sausage that week. Nobody explains how. Nobody wants to. You can't help but marvel at the sheer pragmatism of it all. The work is dangerous, yes, but it's not frantic, it's not rushed. Every movement is measured, every tool respected, every loaf used to its last crumb. Somewhere in the back, a boy sharpens knives with a whetstone. The scraping blends into the market sounds, like someone whispering in steel, another sound layered into this odd lullaby. And through it all, the bread is there. Silent, crumbly, waiting. You look again at the tools lined up beside the block. Each one carries a scar, a stain, a shine from being cleaned again and again by something we'd consider waste. But here, it's part of the process. Bread isn't just food. It's safety. It's habit. It's the quiet step between butchery and order. And you? You're still here, still leaning, still listening, still watching as another loaf is picked up, pressed gently against steel, and wiped slowly with care. The sun has crept a little higher now, sending pale light across the hanging carcasses and illuminating every dangling sausage like a string of glistening lanterns. The butcher squints upward, then grumbles something about the glare. He reaches for a length of burlap and strings it between two beams, creating a crude shade. It flaps gently in the breeze, casting patterned shadows over the table. You stretch your arms and glance down the alley. A friar shuffles past, clutching a bundle of rosemary. He pauses briefly to nod at the butcher, then mutters a half-blessing toward the hanging beef ribs. A blessing for the dead or the living who must cook it? Hard to tell. Religion and meat have long been entangled, and not just on feast days. In many towns, butchers were required to say brief prayers before slaughter, sometimes a quick Latin murmur, sometimes just a glance skyward. It wasn't always pious, it was practical. Better safe than eternally damned, especially if you just split a sheep's skull before breakfast. Historians still argue whether these blessings were genuine signs of faith or simply habit, something inherited from pagan customs, transformed by the church, then folded into daily work, like another step in a recipe. Either way, it's part of the rhythm now. Cut, wipe, nod to the heavens. The apprentice is watching carefully. He mimics the butcher's gestures, slightly exaggerated, as if rehearsing for a play. He picks up a knife, checks its edge, and, without instruction, presses a heel of stale bread to the blade. 1, 2, 3 swipes. Almost reverent. You can tell this loaf has seen many sins. It's stained and curling at the edges like parchment in a fire. He folds it in half to find a cleaner side. It crumbles slightly. He frowns but continues. Nearby, a woman in a worn apron approaches the stall. Her eyes flick to the bread, then to the butcher. She places a small wooden token on the table, an offering or maybe a request. The butcher nods once, then reaches under the table for a carefully wrapped bundle. You watch her walk away, bread in one hand, a lamb shank in the other. It's subtle, but you begin to see the deeper meaning. The bread isn't just a cleaning tool. It's a gesture, a symbol, a bridge between necessity and belief. It wipes the blade, yes, but also cleanses, in a way, the act itself. There's no modern squeamishness here. Just the acceptance that death is part of dinner and that you do your best to carry it out with steadiness, if not grace. In some towns, butchers were even considered impure, not ritually unclean necessarily, but marked by the nature of their work. It's said that some were required to sit at separate church pews or were buried in special graveyards. A trade blessed by utility, but forever a little sticky. Spiritually speaking, you glance at the stack of used bread loaves in the corner. They're piled like small edible tombstones, sacrificed for the sake of cleanliness. Most will be tossed to animals or fed to the town's pigsty, which ironically is cleaner than some homes. Some loaves, though, they'll be burned. Bread that's soaked too deeply with animal fluids was seen as impure. Better to send it back to ash. There's a phrase from a 15th century English market ordinance: "Clean thy steel as ye clean thy soul with the crust of toil." No one's sure if it was meant literally or metaphorically, but here it's both. The dog reappears, nose lifted, tail twitching. He's found another loaf, half eaten by rats but still worth a sniff. He nudges it with his paw, decides against it. Even he has standards. The apprentice, meanwhile, is now practicing cuts on a log of firm turnip. The butcher watches from the side, arms crossed. No words, just a slow nod when the angle is right. Then, predictably, the blade is wiped clean with bread. It's hypnotic. The bread almost disappears into the process, not announced, not exalted, just used. Silently, repeatedly, completely. A customer stops by to ask for shoulder off the bone, but not too much fat. The butcher obliges with minimal ceremony. A few slices, a clean cut, a wipe of the blade with the corner of a rye crust. The transaction is done. Another joke surfaces. Don't trust a butcher with clean hands or clean bread. Meaning, if there's no mess, there's no work. Bread without blood is just breakfast. Bread with it? That's proof of labor. You look around now with new eyes, the sawdust on the floor, the baskets of bones, the hooks strung like musical notes across the ceiling, and the loaves, lined up or discarded, each one a chapter in the day's story. The apprentice moves to sweep the floor with a branch broom, But before he does, he stoops to pick up a loaf that's fallen face down in the muck. He holds it up to the light, considering it. Still got one good side, he says to no one in particular. He tucks it into his belt and keeps sweeping. And somehow, that's the most medieval thing you've seen all morning. The bells of the nearby chapel begin their slow, heavy pealing, marking the noonday hour. It's not a church service you're interested in, though. It's lunchtime, or as the butcher calls it, the hour of elbow grease and onions. He doesn't stop working. Not really. He just shifts gears. Now it's the turn of the premium cuts, the showpieces, the ones that require a bit more care. A roast for a noble table, veal for the inn, a suspiciously large order of lamb necks for the monastery cook who definitely isn't feeding just monks. You notice something different now, almost ceremonial. The butcher's tools have changed. His apron's been folded at the waist to reveal a cleaner portion. His hands are freshly rinsed in a bucket of half-used wine, likely left over from last night's roast. And his cleaning bread? Upgraded. This loaf is fancier, more compact, less crumbs, more crust, probably baked by the same baker who supplies the Lord's Hall. Even the dogs don't recognize it at first. Historians still debate whether the use of quality bread for cleaning was a social signal or just coincidence. Guild accounts in some cities describe fines for using courtly loaves to clean common meat, but enforcement seems to have been patchy at best. The unwritten rule? You use the bread you had, or the bread that wouldn't sell. But here's the thing. Bread, like tools, could become a status symbol. Not all loaves were equal. Just as a well-forged cleaver earned you respect among peers, a supply of fine, dense crusts from a noble kitchen could earn you quiet admiration or mild jealousy. A good cleaning loaf was firm but forgiving, rough enough to polish steel, but gentle enough to keep the blade's edge intact. You watch as the butcher lifts his best cleaver, a wide, elegant piece with a smooth walnut handle and a polished blade etched faintly with a family mark. He lays it gently across the table, almost as if introducing it to the bread. Then comes the ritual. One slow pass of the crust across the back edge, then another along the flat of the blade. Tiny flecks of dried blood fall away like autumn leaves. He breathes out softly. Not quite a sigh, more like appreciation. His apprentice is back at the turnip again, muttering rhythms under his breath. Slice, sweep, swipe, slice, sweep, swipe. He's got his own loaf now, a reject from this morning's baking batch, shaped oddly like a frog. He seems attached to it, has even named it. You overhear him whisper, "Come on, Jeffrey," as he scrubs down a curved knife. It's bizarrely endearing. Class plays a bigger role in the butcher's life than most folks realize. Your tools, your stall, even your bread, these things send signals. There's the poor man's butcher, hacking away on secondhand pine with an old crust of black barley. And then there's the guild-backed butcher with his iron rack, hand-oiled blades, and crusts delivered straight from a cathedral bakery. It's all meat, but some of it smells of money. You notice a pattern in the clientele now. A woman in velvet gloves approaches with a handkerchief pressed to her nose. She's buying bones for her lapdog, she says, but clearly doesn't want to linger. The butcher, amused, selects the cleanest joint and wipes it with a corner of his finest bread before handing it over. Crust still clinging to the knuckle. She nods, grudgingly impressed, and hurries off, stepping delicately over the gutter. There's also a gentleman from the town guard demanding liver and none of that grainy rubbish. He's handed a chunk with extra care, the blade. Wipe twice before it touches the meat. Presentation matters. The dog from earlier, let's call him Patch, slinks back into view. He sniffs around the base of the table, nudging a crust that's been discarded, He knows the good bread from the bad. He noses one half loaf aside in distaste. The next, jackpot. He plucks it delicately in his jaws and vanishes behind a stack of crates. Meanwhile, the apprentice is now testing Jeffrey on more delicate blades. He's surprisingly diligent, wiping slowly, rotating the bread for optimal contact, then inspecting each knife like a tiny swordsman. You get the sense this isn't just work, it's pride. There's something almost meditative about it, a form of care hidden in a violent trade. Between the cracking bones, the flying fat, and the clatter of coin, this little ritual, the bread wiping, brings calm. It's as close to tenderness as you're going to get in a place filled with carcasses. In some markets, they say a butcher's character was judged by his bread. Too clean? He wasn't working hard enough. Too soaked? He was careless. Too little? Stingy. Too much? Wasteful. But just right? Just right was magic. You look down again at the tools laid out like a feast. Each one has been touched by crust. Each one carries a sheen of respect. The bread doesn't just remove blood. It preserves the blade. It resets the scene. It closes one story and prepares for the next. There's a brief lull. The sun is directly overhead now, casting warm stripes through the gaps in the roof. The butcher takes a seat for a moment, drinks something sour and lukewarm from a flask. The apprentice settles next to him, Jeffrey clutched in both hands like a sacred object. They don't talk. They don't need to. The work speaks for them. And the bread? It rests too. Crumbs everywhere. The heroes of the hour, unnoticed by most but essential to all. The midday warmth has reached its peak, and with it comes the undeniable scent of fermenting cabbage wafting in from a nearby stall. But here in the butcher's shaded corner, the rhythm remains steady. The meat grows heavier in the heat, the flies more persistent, but the work never truly stops. And neither does the bread. You shift your gaze from the tools to the people, not the customers, but the ones behind the scenes. The wives, the daughters, the sisters, the quiet machinery that keeps this grisly little world turning. You wouldn't have noticed them at first. That's the point. They move like background music, essential but rarely center stage. There's the butcher's wife, for instance. She's emerged from the back of the stall, carrying a bowl of vinegar and something wrapped in linen. She doesn't say a word, just walks over to a blood-slicked table and begins rubbing down the wood in practiced arcs. And then there's her bread. Thinner, flatter, almost like a biscuit left out too long. She uses it differently with tighter motions, like scrubbing grime off a copper kettle. The linen she carries? A secondary wipe. But the bread comes first. Historians still argue whether women were officially allowed to serve as butchers in the medieval period. Guild records are vague, often listing them only as household help or assistants. But in practice, they were everywhere. Behind the counters, under the tables, carrying meat, cleaning tools, preparing for feasts, and, when their husbands were off drinking or dead, running the entire operation. They weren't always welcomed. Some cities issued fines for women who sold meat without a male sponsor. Others looked the other way, especially if the meat was good. Profit has a funny way of making people flexible. The butcher's daughter appears next. She's no more than 12, but already moves with the same weary grace as her father. She carries a bundle of kindling in one hand and, slung over her shoulder, a crusted-up round of bread in a cloth sling like it's a baby goat. She plops it down beside the knife rack, and you realize even she knows what it's for. This loaf is different again, scored with cuts, chipped on one side, and bent slightly in the middle like it's been crushed under something heavy, but it's still useful. She grabs a skinning knife and begins to scrub it with the loaf, brow furrowed, tongue poking slightly from one side of her mouth in concentration. It's endearing and mildly terrifying. A customer watches her with curiosity and mutters, "She'll be better than her old man one day." The butcher doesn't deny it. He just grunts and keeps trimming cartilage from a pork shoulder. In the darker corners of the market, you might also find the meat smugglers. Not robbers exactly, just women who skirt the guild rules. Widows selling sausage from home kitchens. Daughters running deliveries without permission. They buy cuts after hours, slice them thin, salt them just right, and sell them wrapped in linen to neighbors in exchange for onions, gossip, or shoe repairs. Their knives? Hidden in baskets. Their bread? Pocket-sized. Cleaning on the go, one crust at a time. You can imagine it now. A back alley behind a baker's shop, a woman crouched beside a basket, wiping a blade with a crust while chickens peck nearby. It's almost a ritual, almost sacred. Of course, there's resentment too. Some male butchers call these women crust stealers or blade witches. It's meant to be insulting, but honestly, it sounds kind of cool. There's even a legend told in hushed tones in a few towns. A woman butcher known only as Crumb. Supposedly, she could clean 3 knives at once, using only a single crust, a splash of cider, and a whisper of Latin. Whether she existed or not, her story lingers like a ghost in the flour. Back at the stall, the butcher's wife has finished her wiping and moved on to wrapping offcuts in linen. She pauses to hand her daughter a heel of crust for a second round of cleaning. The girl accepts it solemnly, like it's a knight's sword. Bread as baton. Bread as legacy. You glance again at the pile of rejected loaves near the back door. Some are half-eaten. Some gnawed by rats. Some burned on one side like they were left in an oven too long. But each one has found a second life here. No loaf is wasted. Even in failure, it has a function. The dog sniffs at one, but quickly walks away. Even he knows this pile is for work, not snacks. There's a lull again. The sun is past its highest point. The air feels thick, but not oppressive. You hear the low hum of voices from nearby stalls, the creak of wagon wheels, the soft flutter of birds overhead. In this moment of quiet, the women do their most important work. The knives are wiped, the tables cleaned, the next cuts lined up. Bread moves from hand to hand like currency, measured not in bites, but in swipes. And you, sitting quietly on your barrel, begin to feel it, the gentle, crumb-coated rhythm of unseen labor. The kind that doesn't ask for applause, the kind that just gets done, because someone has to clean the blades. You're almost lulled into forgetting what you're looking at. Tools, meat, and crust of bread worn down to near dust. But then you hear it. A sharp curse, a clatter, and the sudden high-pitched scree of something scurrying across the rafters. The butcher's wife grabs a broom, because today's bread has finally gone bad. It happens sooner or later. There's always one loaf that crosses the line from usable to hazardous. This one, it seems, had been forgotten too long behind a barrel of salted offal. It's moldy, greener than it should be, and worse, it's become a beacon for the local rat family. The apprentice, startled, kicks a bucket in his rush to escape a furry blur that darts past his leg. The butcher doesn't flinch. He casually picks up a meat hook and hurls it, missing the rat by a generous margin but making his point. "That's what happens when you let bread sit too long," he mutters, shaking his head. "Attracts more vermin than the bishop's cheese pantry." You chuckle. Of course, cleaning bread wasn't meant to be stored. It wasn't meant to last. Butchers knew it. Customers knew it. Rats, unfortunately, knew it best of all. Historians still argue whether pest control methods in butcher stalls were formalized or improvised. Some guilds insisted on cats. Others allowed traps, crude things made of bent iron and terrifying ingenuity. But one rule popped up again and again: no rotting crusts on the premises. A crust too soaked in fat or blood could fester. It became a meal not just for animals, but for disease. Bread, in its noble second life as cleaning tool, carried a time limit. The daughter, with admirable calm, marches over and picks up the offending loaf. She holds it at arm's length like it might bite her. It's soft on one side now, almost slimy, with a strange purple patch that looks worryingly alive. The butcher nods toward the fire pit. She tosses it in without ceremony. A little puff of black smoke, a brief sizzle, and it's gone. Just another offering to the gods of sanitation and survival. There's a second pile forming now. Not quite dangerous, but definitely past their prime. A few loaves crack down the middle, some too crumbly to wipe with. One has what appears to be a tooth mark, possibly canine, possibly human. Let's not ask. Patch the dog eyes them longingly, but even he hesitates. You can't help but imagine a scale. On one side, hygiene. On the other, hunger. For medieval folks, the balance tipped back and forth constantly. You remember reading that in times of famine, even cleaning bread was reboiled, softened, and repurposed. Maybe turned into pottage. Maybe disguised with herbs. It sounds disgusting, but desperation doesn't worry about flavor. It just wants calories. There's a record from 1421 in a small Flemish town where bread loaves were rationed out to butchers each week specifically for cleaning, and any loaf unfit for the purpose had to be buried or burned. They even marked them with black soot to keep people from eating them later. Whether that worked is uncertain. The apprentice finds a soggy crust behind a pile of firewood. He lifts it like a prize and holds it out for inspection. The butcher walks over, inspects it silently, then whaps the boy lightly on the head with it. Dust explodes off the crust. The boy sneezes. The lesson is learned. The bread must be hard. It must be dry. It must scrub. A crust too soft will smear, not wipe. A crust too old invites rot. A crust too flavorful brings flies. It's an art. You've started to notice which loaves come from where. The tall rye bricks with the neat edges. Those come from the baker near the dye house. The oval barley ones with the odd taste. From the baker who sings too loudly at night and sometimes sells pies with suspiciously sour fillings. And then there are the specialty loaves, cut thin, baked long, crusted with oat or ash, crafted specifically for wiping blades clean. Expensive, rare, usually reserved for feast days or noble visits. A cleaning crust fit for a queen. Literally. There's a saying on the wall behind the counter, half faded in chalk. A clean knife speaks no lies. It's cryptic, like most sayings, but you get the feeling the bread plays a part in that truth. A clean blade means honest work, safe meat, a stall you can trust, and bread, even at its filthiest, is the thing that makes that possible. The wife returns with a new basket, today's discard pile from the bakery. Crusts and heels, all squared off and dry. Some are cracked. A few are still warm from the oven, dried intentionally. The butcher inspects one with the care of a jeweler examining a gem. He nods. This'll do. Then, almost automatically, he hands it to his daughter. She lights up like she's just been knighted. Bread, once again, saves the day. You glance at the pile of moldy rejects, now carefully swept into a sack marked fire. It's handled with surprising respect. After all, even failed bread served a purpose. It reminded you what not to do, where not to step, what not to wipe. As the rat returns briefly to sniff around and is met with another well-aimed broom, you settle deeper into your seat. It's a strange thought that something so simple, so ordinary, could hold such power, not in grand gestures, but in quiet, repeated acts, wiping, scrubbing, preventing illness, saving fingers, maintaining trust, all with a crust. The fire has died down to glowing coals now, faintly pulsing in their stone ring. The rejected loaves, those too soft, too rotten, too suspicious, have done their final duty, crackling into ash as the butcher's wife gives the iron poker one last turn. She wipes her hands on her apron and doesn't bother glancing at the smoke rising in slow spirals. It's just part of the job. But back at the main table, a new task begins. The deeper clean. This is the moment where bread meets its most formidable rivals, ash paste, hot ale, and, if you're very lucky or very rich, boiling water. The butcher is preparing to clean his tools not just from blood and fat, but from judgment. Guild inspections tomorrow, and that means every cleaver must shine, at least a little. You watch him gather his cleaning tools. There's the usual bread, of course, but also a pot of dark sludge, ash mixed with leftover vinegar probably, a basin of ale, gone flat and warm, a rag that once was white and now resembles the inside of a chimney, and finally, an old wooden ladle, not for soup, for pouring. He starts with the bread, always the bread. It's the first line of defense. You can't go straight to liquids. There's too much solid gunk to handle. So he grabs his thickest loaf and begins scrubbing the edge of a boning knife with slow, steady pressure. It's like watching someone erase a very specific kind of sin. The crust peels away layers of grease. The blade catches the light just a bit more with each pass. Crumbs fall like snow over the table. Then comes the ash paste. He dabs a bit on the bread itself, not a rag, never a rag, and begins to work it into the groove near the hilt of the cleaver. The paste makes a faint fizzing sound. You wonder if that's real or just your imagination. Either way, it looks satisfying. Historians still debate the most effective blade cleaning techniques used by butchers in medieval Europe. Some argue that hot wine mixed with salt was preferred in France, while others point to Anglo-Saxon texts that mention oaten crust dipped in bitter cider as the ideal degreaser. Naturally, none of this was standardized. It all depended on what you had, and more often than not, what you had was old bread and a strong stomach. The apprentice, eager to prove his value, brings over a dented copper pot filled with water that's been simmering over coals all morning. It bubbles gently. He ladles a small amount over the blade, and it hisses on contact, steam curling upward like a ghost. The butcher nods his approval. But then comes the sacred moment, the final bread swipe. After ash, after ale, after heat, one last drag of the crust, this time slower, more ceremonial. Not because it cleans better, but because it feels right. A punctuation mark. There's something reassuring about it. After all the liquids and smears, the bread offers closure. It dries, it buffs, it tidies, it whispers, "We're done here." You glance over and see the wife scrubbing a butcher's hook using a twisted length of crust like a sponge on a rope. It bends as she works, forming perfectly to the metal's cruel little curve. It's a task no rag could do as well. The daughter, meanwhile, has taken her turn at the ash pot. She's cleaning the small paring blades, her tiny fingers surprisingly deft. She dunks her crust in the paste, rubs it in tight little circles, then wipes each blade dry with a fresh corner of the loaf. If she's lucky, she'll grow up with all 10 fingers. If not, she'll at least have the cleanest blades in town. The apprentice, for his part, has developed a new system, cleaning the knives in order of size, lining them up on a clean plank, and placing a fresh bread heel beside each one like an offering. The butcher raises an eyebrow but says nothing. It's not traditional, but it's neat. A customer lingers near the edge of the stall. He watches the cleaning ritual and eventually asks, "Do you sell those crusts?" The butcher smirks. "Not unless you plan to scrub your boots." "I might." And it's true. People did. Old bread was used to clean all kinds of things. Tools, boots, pewter tankards, even fingernails in desperate times. It was the medieval version of a sponge, a paper towel, and a Brillo pad all in one. Multi-purpose. Disposable. Surprisingly effective. But let's be honest, it's not glamorous. It's not even that efficient by modern standards. But in a world without bleach, antibacterial sprays, or microfiber cloths, bread did the job. And it did it with dignity. Mostly. The butcher lines up his clean tools with the care of a craftsman laying out fine silver. Cleavers, skinning knives, boning hooks, rib saws, even the blunt-tipped blade he uses for cracking joints. All gleam, just a little, under the filtered afternoon light. They aren't perfect, they aren't polished, but they are ready. And beside each one, a fragment of the bread that got them there, cracked, crumbed, used up, honored. The fire pops gently behind you. The last crusts are tossed into it, their work complete. A faint smell of burnt yeast drifts through the stall. You close your eyes and listen. The scrape of crust on steel, the hiss of warm ale, the murmur of the apprentice counting his blades, the soft murmur of the butcher to no one in particular, perhaps to the tools or the bread or just himself. And you realize this is the cleanest it's going to get. The day has slipped into its long golden afternoon stretch when time starts to feel syrupy and the heat clings to everything like a damp cloak. The streets are quieter now. Most customers have gone off to roast their purchases, and the only ones left are latecomers, chatty neighbors, or the occasional meat haggler hoping for a discount on scraps. But inside the butcher stall, things are far from idle. This is guild inspection season, and that means rules. So many rules you could fill a sausage casing with them and still have some left over. The butcher doesn't particularly enjoy this time of year, but he respects it. You have to. If you want to keep your stall, your license, your reputation, you've got to play by the book. And that includes how you clean your tools. There's a thick wooden plaque nailed to one post in the stall, carved with the guild's name and marked with fines in chalk. 5 pence for blood left on the block, 2 pence for spoiled liver, 3 pence for crusts thrown in public drains. The writing changes weekly, it seems, depending on which guild officer is feeling particularly dramatic. The butcher glares at the list like it's a former friend. He motions to his apprentice, who's already reaching for a fresh bread loaf. Not to eat, of course, but to comply. Guild rules about tool cleaning are, technically, strict. Butchers must demonstrate cleanliness daily. Tools should be wiped with a dry material after every use. A wet cloth can be used, but not before a dry wipe. Cleaning must happen in full view of customers. And if you're not using proper linen, well, you'd better be using bread. Historians still argue how widely these rules were enforced. Some towns were strict, like Bruges or Florence, where surprise inspections could result in fines, stall closures, or public shaming. Others were more relaxed, especially in rural areas where guilds had less power and local custom overruled official policy. But here, this is a guild town, and the bread is under scrutiny. The butcher lines up 3 blades in quick succession and performs the now familiar ritual: bread rub, ash dab, bread buff. He doesn't look up once. The apprentice hovers nearby with an extra crust in hand, like a squire waiting to hand over a lance. Then comes the most dreaded task: blade presentation. You hear the crunch of leather boots on cobblestones before you see the inspector. He's tall, pale, slightly hunched from a lifetime of peering at sausages too closely. He carries a ledger in one hand and a folding magnifying glass in the other, which he flips open like a knight drawing a sword. "Clean steel," he says without greeting. The butcher nods and gestures. The inspector leans in, eyeing each blade with theatrical intensity. He taps the cleaver once, sniffs it, yes, sniffs it, and then wipes a finger along the hilt. He raises it, checking for residue. None. He frowns in disappointment, perhaps hoping to catch someone out. And the method of cleaning? The butcher lifts the bread. The inspector sniffs it too. His nose wrinkles. Good crust. Proper age. No mold. You almost laugh. This man has a nose for dough. He checks the work table next, tracing a finger through the fine layer of crumbs and blood left behind. It's not spotless, but it's clearly been tended. The inspector jots a note in his ledger. There was a case in Ghent, he says dryly, where a butcher wiped his blades with his hat. He doesn't explain how that ended, but his tone suggests a tragic loss for both hygiene and fashion. The wife appears quietly, offering a bowl of warm water and a separate crust, one used earlier that morning. The inspector dips the crust in the bowl, watches it crumble slightly and nods. Not too soft, he mutters. Good. Patch the dog, sensing tension, creeps forward and lies down at your feet. You give him a subtle pat. He's been here before. He knows the drill. The inspector finally straightens, closes his magnifier, and chalks a mark beside the butcher's name on the guild list. A circle. That's a good sign. Passable, he says. But your boy needs to sharpen that skinning knife better. It'll pull instead of slice. The apprentice swallows visibly and nods. The inspector vanishes down the alley, already lecturing someone about the unforgivable sin of green sausages. The butcher exhales, then turns to the apprentice with a half smile. Could have been worse. You exhale too. It's funny. In a world where meat is hacked from bone with barely a wince, where flies swarm and dogs prowl, the most delicate performance of the day is a crust of bread gliding along a knife edge under a stranger's eye. The apprentice picks up the skinning blade, studies it for a moment, and reaches for Geoffrey, the now legendary crust he's used all day. He frowns. Geoffrey is falling apart. Too many scrubs, too much ash, too many stories. He hesitates. Then, carefully, he tears off the cleanest corner and begins again. One long stroke along the blade. Gentle, respectful, almost like saying goodbye. As the inspector's footsteps fade, swallowed by the murmuring market, a quiet relief settles over the stall. Even the tools seem to relax a little, gleaming just enough to say, "We survived that nonsense." The butcher cracks his knuckles. The apprentice exhales like he's just escaped a public execution. And the daughter resumes whittling scraps of crust into tiny animals with a paring knife. Today it's a goat. Yesterday it was a suspiciously long duck. But now it's time to pack up, sort of. Because not all butchers work from a fixed stall. Some, especially in smaller towns or along trade roads, are traveling butchers, vagabonds of venison, peddlers of pork. These men, and occasionally women, roam with carts, barrels, folding tables, and a small arsenal of blades rolled in canvas like deadly scrolls. And of course, they bring bread. You imagine one now, a traveling butcher pulling his cart into a village square, the wheels squeaking like an old song, his cloak flapping behind him, and tucked into the corner of his wooden kit, 2 fat, crusty loaves. One for eating, one for cleaning. Historians still debate the actual routines of these roaming meatmen. Some traveled solo, others with apprentices or even entire families. A few worked under contracts from monasteries or noble estates. Most had to work quickly, clean efficiently, and move on before the smell caught up with them. Bread in their case was a miracle. Water wasn't always safe. Streams could be stagnant. Wells could be fouled. But a hunk of dry bread, that could clean a blade in seconds. You picture it now. After slicing a goose for a peasant family, the butcher pulls out a stale heel from his apron, gives his cleaver a firm swipe, and carries on. No rinsing. No boiling. Just a swipe and a nod. Some butchers even had preferences for their travel loaves. Flatter breads were easier to pack. Crust-heavy loaves lasted longer without growing mold. And rye? Rye was the undisputed champion. Dense, durable, and almost immune to flavor loss, even if it spent a few hours pressed against a pig bladder. The stall's own apprentice seems to enjoy imagining it too. He asks, "You think the traveling butchers get better crusts?" The butcher raises an eyebrow. "They get colder crusts." You've heard of crust tricks too. Small hacks pass between butchers at roadside inns. One trick involved rubbing a crust with dry salt before wiping down a skinning knife, supposedly sharpen the edge and deodorize the metal. Another involved toasting the bread over a candle flame to harden it just before scrubbing a cleaver. It also gave the crust a smoky scent, which customers claimed made the meat taste richer. Total nonsense, of course, but charming nonsense. There's even an apocryphal tale of a famous German butcher who cleaned his tools exclusively with pretzels. Dense, twisty, ideal handle. Nobody ever confirmed it, but the idea lingers. Back in your cozy corner of the stall, the butcher is packing his blade roll. Each knife is wrapped in cloth, some embroidered, some patched, and nestled in like sleeping pets. Between each, a chunk of cleaning bread is tucked as padding. It keeps them from clanging, sure, but it also absorbs any remaining oil or fat. And it ensures that should the need arise, he can unwrap, slice, wipe, and rewrap in seconds. A little traveling theater of the practical. The wife approaches with a small leather pouch. Inside, not coin, but crumbs. You tilt your head. "Sharpest bits," she says simply. "The crusts that chipped off after the bone hook." She sprinkles them in a tin at the back of the stall, where they'll be mixed with sawdust and pressed into a sort of greasy brick, used later to light the cooking fire. Nothing wasted, not even the cleaning crumbs. And then, just when you think the bread has reached its limit, a neighbor drops by with a strange request. He's hosting a wedding feast 2 towns over, and the local butcher can't travel. Would this butcher send someone to help? Maybe a cart, a few tools, and most importantly, could he bring his bread? The butcher doesn't laugh. He simply glances at the apprentice. "You up for a road trip?" The apprentice lights up. He nods too fast, nearly knocks over a bowl of tallow. Then the daughter, not missing a beat, throws Geoffrey, the battle-hardened crust from earlier, into the butcher's satchel. "For luck," she says. The apprentice clutches the satchel to his chest like it's filled with gold or ham. The travel butcher life isn't glamorous. It's bumpy roads, sticky knives, and animals that don't always want to die on schedule. But it's full of stories. And at the center of those stories, always, always, is the bread, the cleaning loaf, the traveler's rag, the unsung hero. The apprentice leaves tomorrow. He'll take 2 knives, a sharpening stone, a small pouch of ash, and 4 loaves, 1 to eat, 3 to wipe. His hands will be raw by the 3rd day. His cloak will smell like mutton, and by the end of it, he'll understand why you never forget to pack extra crust. You arrive the next morning to find the stall quieter than usual. A hush has settled over the meat district, like a market holding its breath. The butcher's apprentice has already set off, cart rolling unevenly behind him, trailing a faint scent of smoked pork and rye crumbs. He's gone to play meat peddler now, somewhere along a dusty trade road lined with stone fences and barking dogs. Back at the stall, everything continues, but at a slightly slower pace. You notice a new loaf has appeared, large, oval, still firm, but not too dry. This is the morning bread, the one used for first cuts of the day. Its surface is scored neatly, like a thatched roof, and the smell is faintly smoky, as though it rode in on the same cart as last night's firewood. The butcher examines it, presses a thumb into its crust, and nods, satisfactory. Then the first customer of the day arrives, a tall woman with 2 baskets and a scowl. She wants kidneys, specifically the good ones, not the mush. She points at the cleaver like she owns it. The butcher obliges, pulling the liver tray forward and selecting a long, thin blade with a handle bound in red cord. Swipe, slice, wipe. Bread to blade, blade to meat, meat to basket. It's as seamless as breathing. You've begun to recognize the rhythm of this act not just as practical, but as performance. For some butchers, especially those in more competitive towns, the bread wipe is an art form, a quiet display of professionalism, a subtle way to say, I care about this cut, and I care about you not dying from it. And in more refined cities, Paris, Milan, Prague, it went further. Butchers competed on cleanliness. There were clean blade contests during feast days. A judge would walk the market, randomly selecting tools to inspect and rate their cleanliness by smell, shine, and crumb residue. Winners might get ribbons. Losers got publicly shamed. One traveler from Bruges wrote in his diary about a butcher who wore a sash decorated with dried bread heels, each marked with a customer's name and date. It was equal parts hygiene record and weirdly edible trophy case. Back in your alley, though, things are simpler. The butcher moves through his morning orders, ribs for the innkeeper, trotters for the baker's mother, and a small roast for a young couple who probably can't afford it. He throws in a little extra, quietly. They blush. He grunts. Between each transaction, the blade returns to the bread. Today's loaf is holding up well. After each cut, he turns it slightly, like a clock. Noon, 3 o'clock, 6. Each side is used in rotation. Efficiency, familiarity, respect. The dog, Patch, watches this process with something like reverence. He doesn't beg today. He just sits, tail thumping faintly, eyes locked on the crust. The butcher doesn't toss the bread. Not yet. It's still good. Then the daughter returns from running errands with 2 new loaves tucked under her arms like footballs. She places them carefully on the shelf above the blade rack, wiping her hands on her tunic as she does. She watches her father for a moment. Then she imitates his motion, an invisible cleaver, a pretend wipe. The bread is imaginary, but her precision is real. She's learning. Historians still debate the full extent of children's involvement in medieval butchery. Most agree that sons were apprenticed early, but daughters? Less so. Yet in markets across Europe, there are fleeting records of girls working the stalls, especially during holidays, plagues, or after wars emptied the family ranks. One guild document refers to Sarah of the South Lane, a girl of 10 who reportedly kept her blades so bright they blinded the rats. Whether that's literal or just guild flattery is unknown, but her name is etched in the margins of the record alongside her tally of sales. That's legacy, crust by crust. The daughter now reaches for the backup loaf, an older one, slightly cracked along the bottom. She selects a fish filleting blade and begins cleaning. You watch her rotate the bread just like her father did. Noon, 3, 6. She skips 9 o'clock. The crust there is crumbling, and continues. The butcher glances her way, offers a small nod, then returns to his cutting. And you sit there, soaking it in. The scrape of bread on steel, the rustle of linen wrapping a clean blade, the creak of hooks swinging gently in the breeze. A lullaby in the language of work. At the edge of the stall, a new face appears, an old man selling onions. He pauses to admire the cleaning bread. He chuckles. Still using rye, eh? My old boss swore by barley, said it sharpened his temper along with his knife. The butcher smirks. Rye doesn't talk back. They share a chuckle. The old man tosses him a small sack of onions. Trade? The butcher cuts off a few marrow bones and nods. Fair deal. The bread absorbs one more story, one more trade, one more morning passed in quiet ritual. And you? You sit, breathing in the scent of steel, fat, and toasted flour. You feel the peace of it, the predictability. It's the kind of rhythm that carries across years and generations, a crust at a time. The day drifts on, the sunlight fading from bright gold to a lazy amber, casting long shadows from the butcher's stall out onto the cobbled street. Business is slower now. Most shoppers have retreated to their kitchens, and only the occasional passer-by pokes their head in for just a scrap, or perhaps a rumor. It's the perfect moment for reflection, and for art. Because yes, believe it or not, even the humble act of cleaning a cleaver with bread has left its mark on medieval paintings, manuscripts, and dusty old recipe books where you least expect it. You settle in, eyes drifting toward a shelf above the table where the butcher stores what can only be described as paperwork. Not parchment ledgers or tax scrolls, mind you, but little oddments, drawings, recipes scribbled in coal, pressed herbs, and what appears to be a torn page from a breviary that's now being used as a meat order tally. Sacred text, meat sausage list. Among these scraps, there's a brittle piece of parchment no bigger than your palm. Faded ink lines depict a scene. A man, presumably a butcher, wiping a blade with something that, if you squint, is unmistakably a loaf of bread. Not a cloth, not a sponge. A loaf, round, crusty, honest. The butcher catches your gaze. That's me Granddad's old guild drawing, he says. Copied from the record house before it burned. He points to the faint Latin scrawl beneath the image. You make out panem et ferrum mundandum, bread for the cleansing of steel. Historians still argue about depictions like these. Some insist the artists were simply illustrating metaphor. Bread as a symbol of purity, of restoration. Others, more practical, believe they were just drawing what they saw, bread used as a cleaning tool in daily life. Why idealize a rag when the butcher's crust was far more interesting? In illuminated manuscripts, especially those tucked in the back of apothecaries' ledgers or feast day records, tiny marginalia sometimes show blades being scraped clean with brown lumps that suspiciously resemble bread ends. Next to dancing rabbits and stern saints, you'll find these mundane vignettes of medieval labor, the sacred and the crusty, side by side. You imagine some long-dead monk pausing between psalms to doodle a cleaver being wiped with a rye heel. Not for glory, not for symbolism, just because he saw it earlier that day and it stuck with him. There's even a recipe book from 1478, compiled in the kitchens of a minor French duchy, that includes a note on knife care. Wipe with wine, then bread. Let dry on linen. If none, use daughter's apron. Charming, terrifying, entirely believable. The daughter, speaking of aprons, now stands at the back of the stall, scrubbing a sausage stuffer with the blunt side of a crust. She hums while she works, something off-key and comforting. Beside her is a small slate where she's been practicing letters. Next to A for apple and B for boar, she's drawn a loaf of bread and a knife. C is for cleaver, a butcher's alphabet. You can't help but smile. Maybe the bread is cleaner tradition will live on, if only in crayon sketches. Then a visitor arrives, a dusty traveler, robes faded, beard trailing into his belt, a scholar of some kind. He's not here to buy, he's here to ask. I've heard, he says softly, that you clean your knives with bread. The butcher raises an eyebrow. What else would I clean 'em with? Silk? The man laughs, pulls out a slim leather journal and begins scribbling notes. He asks about the types of loaves, how long they're used, whether there's a preference between ends and middles. He even wants to weigh the crusts. The butcher humors him. The daughter offers a loaf to examine. Patch the dog tries to eat it. The scholar politely declines. Later, when he's gone, the butcher mutters, "They'll be painting crusts into chapel murals next." You chuckle, but truthfully, you wouldn't be surprised. Because bread, like so much else in history, doesn't just feed the body, it feeds memory. It leaves crumbs in the corners of archives, smudges in the margins, stories tucked between verses. Even in this dusty corner of the world, crusts tell tales. You look around and realize the tools glint in the fading light. The loaf, half used, rests at the corner of the cutting board. The apprentice's empty seat still bears a dusting of crumbs. The drawings above sway slightly in the breeze. It's all part of the record, not the kind carved in marble or sung in cathedrals, but the kind left behind in oil, ink, and hard, crumbed crust. The kind future scholars will puzzle over and whisper about in vaulted libraries. And maybe, just maybe, the kind someone will someday paint into the corner of a grand scene. A butcher wiping a blade with bread while saints and kings look on. Dusk now. That tender hush when even the flies begin to settle and the dogs curl into soft, meat-scented heaps beneath the stalls. You sit quietly, elbow resting on a barrel, watching the butcher perform his final rites for the day. Not a prayer exactly, but a ceremony nonetheless. There's no rush. This is the calmest part of the routine. The meat's all been sold, salted, or bundled in linen. The tools, though, those still need care. You notice him choose the same old stool, worn smooth where hundreds of evenings have passed, just like this one. And in his lap, the last loaf. Not the fresh morning crust, not the fancy ash-rubbed one from inspection day. This one is tired, bent, cracked along its spine. A veteran. The daughter fetches a basin of water, careful not to slosh. The wife lights a small oil lamp. The flame casts long shadows across the table, stretching each cleaver's form like a ghost reaching for the rafters. And one by one, the blades come out. This time, the wiping is slower. The butcher doesn't speak. He just runs the crust gently, deliberately, over each tool. The bread is softened now, barely holding together, but it still does the job. The smears are faint, the residue thin. It's less about cleaning at this point and more about honoring the day. The final sweep. Swipe along the flat. Sweep along the curve. A slow press at the hilt where the fingers rest. Historians still argue whether this end-of-day ritual held spiritual meaning. Some suggest it symbolized gratitude for a safe shift. Others believe it was about calming the nerves before nightfall. In some towns, they called it closing the edge, not sheathing the blade, but quieting it. The apprentice would have done it, had he been here. But his tools are gone. He carries his own loaves now. Somewhere out there under a different dusk, he may be doing this same thing. Bread in hand, knife on knee, quiet as stars. The butcher exhales, then places the last cleaned blade back on the rack. He doesn't wipe the table just yet. Instead, he breaks off a piece of the crust and tosses it to Patch. The dog blinks, then trots over, tail wagging. The daughter rests her chin on the bench, watching the lamp flicker. The wife wipes her hands slowly on a rag that's older than the girl, and the butcher leans forward, crust in hand, and wipes one final blade, the small hook used only for rare cuts. It's more symbolic than anything, a gesture of completion. There's a calm in the air, the kind that comes after honest work. A cleanness not of bleach or polish, but of intention. You sit back, letting your body soften into stillness. You hear the creak of the stall's shutter as it's pulled closed, the jingle of the hook being latched, the soft tap, tap, tap of the butcher's fingertips against the bread in his palm. A goodbye. Tomorrow there will be more meat, more blades, more customers who demand less gristle, more gossip about which baker's using too much millet. But for now, the work is done, and the bread, crumbled, stained, noble in its small, weary way, has done everything it needed to. You close your eyes as the last light slips behind the rooftops. You smell the faint tang of iron, the toasted edge of stale rye, the hint of smoke from a dying oil lamp. You feel the rhythm of a long day settle in your chest. The cleavers sleep now. The crusts rest. And so, dear listener, should you. And now, as the market stills, as the fire sinks into embers, let your breath slow. Imagine the smell of the stall fading, no longer thick with blood and fat, but soft, earthy, like flour on a baker's apron. Picture the loaves, now just crumbs and hushed stories, scattered across stone floors and tabletops, quietly marking each place the blade once sang. The dog sleeps, the knives rest, the daughter hums a quiet tune that only the bread knows. In your mind, trace the gentle arc of a crust being swept along a steel edge. Slow, even, purposeful. Let that rhythm carry you now. There's no rush, no more orders to fill, no inspections, just the glow of an oil lamp, a loaf in your hand, and time stretching like warm dough. Even in a world of sharpened edges, there is softness. Let your shoulders fall. Let the noise of the day wash away like breadcrumbs down the gutter. You are safe here. Nothing sharp touches you, only stories. only quiet. The butcher leans back on his stool. He breathes out slowly. So do you. The market sleeps. The bread is spent. The world hushes itself just for you. Close your eyes now. Let the last sweep of the blade carry you away.